All right, my AP Literature friends. So finally getting around to doing FRQ 3 from the 2022 exam, hierarchical structures. So in this writing workshop, I will stick to the status quo and basically demonstrate and illustrate for you, teachers and students, how my students were instructed to manipulate and finagle my templates in order to construct this particular essay. And one of the things that I talk about all the time is that these templates of the inverted and declarative thesis, which we use to construct the introductory paragraphs, and then the syllogistic method, which we use for the body paragraphs, can be used not just for all three FRQs on the literature exam, but my Lang students do it as well for all three FRQs for that. So all 6 FRQs can be tackled with one uniform approach. So it's good for literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, and even when we get into more college level writing, it's perfect for research. So, like I said, I'll stick to the status quo and walk you through a few introductions, walk you through the prompt, and see how we'll construct the body paragraphs as well. So let me jump right in here. And one thing I always say to teachers when I work with them is that you got to Bob Ross your instruction if you're going to use my templates or anyone's template. I think it's good practice. So I give the following analogy all the time, and I'll do it again in case you're new with my work. This idea that if Bob Ross were to come on screen and say, "Hello, happy little people. Today we're going to paint a beautiful New England autumnal landscape with beautiful fall foliage, and in the center of our canvas we're going to include a New England wood-covered bridge." Right? He doesn't pass out a graphic organizer and talk about the theory and the technique of painting in the ether. Like, he gets right to that canvas, right to that easel, and he paints his way through that particular assignment. And I think it's great when composition instructors do the same thing, and I put it in air quotes here, paint with your students, provide plenty of exemplars and models. And one of the kickers about Bob Ross, and not many people know this, is that he called it a heuristic. In composition, we call it template. Just something called the wet on wet technique. Every single time he painted a natural landscape, he always used the wet on wet technique. And for me, when I'm working with teachers and students, it's always declare, invert, syllogistic. So a couple of maneuvers that you can use uniformly across the expository modes. So here's the prompt, and we'll unpack it together and then construct the essay. Many works of literature feature characters who accept or reject a hierarchical structure. This hierarchy may be social, economic, political, or familial, or it may apply to some other kind of structure. Either from your own reading or from the list below, choose a work of fiction in which a character responds to a hierarchy in some significant way. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze how that character's response to the hierarchy contributes to an interpretation of the work as a whole. Do not merely summarize the plot. And every year, the College Board gives us that final little sentiment there. Do not merely summarize the plot. You've got to keep in mind that, we're arguing here. It's an expository essay, but the task is to perform literary analysis from start to finish. And oftentimes when I read anchor papers or, actually read student work, it sounds very plot summative, especially FRQ3 sounds like Cliff Note summation more times than not. And when we get into the syllogistic method, I'll show you a little trick that it's kind of a cheat code or a hack that students can do with that first premise to ensure and guarantee that they are performing literary analysis from start to finish, because that's really important that you meet the demand of the assignment and not get too plot heavy. So the immediate question is this: how do I write the introductory paragraph? And as always, you can declare or invert the thesis. Now, here's the kicker for me when I for AP literature. For my struggling and emerging writers, one little cheat code is all three FRQs can be written with inverted theses. So, I kind of just get, students after an academic year with me, come May, come time for the exam, know exactly where they stand within terms of their ability to write. And some of them just systematically invert every single time. More competent, more nuanced writers can declare when they're performing literary analysis. But most of the time, you'll see my students invert. So let's unpack what I mean by declarative and invert. So with my template, every introduction my students ever write, as long as they have the scaffold of the template in place, is going to be 4 sentences long. No more, no less. Exactly 4 sentences. And we know that in order to articulate the thesis, you kind of hook it on the word hierarchy, hierarchical structures, right? So in the very first sentence, when you declare, you begin with the thesis. Just boom, drop the thesis. So in the first line, if a student is going to declare the thesis, they have to say something about hierarchical arrangements within a particular text. And then from there, it's context and background. I love to see a healthy smattering of what I call tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is just your average run-of-the-mill SAT level word. I run intensive word study academies throughout the academic year, and I'll be doing some webinars on that in the coming weeks. So stay tuned for that if you like how my students are wielding their words. I like, a good balance of colloquial and vernacular, but they have to keep in mind that they're writing for a very academic audience. So I like to see some tier 2 level vocabulary in there. And then the other thing that my students, come time of the exam, tend to do well if they've given me an iota of work is manipulate their sentence constructs, manipulate their syntactical maneuvers. So Strunk and White in their seminal text called Write It Right make the assertion that there's 12 different ways to construct a sentence. And oftentimes with struggling and emerging writers, they over-rely on the short, simple declarative sentence. So you have that choppy flow, choppy flow, choppy flow in terms of their cadence. And I have my students go for better voice rhythm flow, that musicality that sometimes we hear with the better writers. So that's what the whole package is for the template of the declarative thesis. And then when you invert, you just flip it. So you're going to end with the thesis. So in this case, you begin with the context and background. Sometimes students might try to start with a hook or an analogy, but it's the same concepts no matter if you begin with the concept of the hierarchical arrangement or you end with the hierarchical structure as your thesis. Tier 2 sentence constructs, exactly 4 sentences long. Sprinkle in the context and the background without getting plot heavy. So here's the first example. So there's 3 here. 3 different students, and they all have different works. They chose different literary works, but in terms of the style and the structure of articulating the thesis, theoretically, technically, strategically, they're all using the exact same template. So let's see what they do here. Blackness has historically been ratified and endorsed by a power structure that is governed by the oppressive rules of whiteness. So we haven't got the thesis yet, so I'm anticipating that this is going to invert. So let's see. As such, what gets reinforced is a kind of racial hierarchy whereby whiteness is the privileged position to be in, while ethnicity is perceived as being problematic. This is especially true of Celie in the color purple. Alice Walker's intent, however, is to subvert the patriarchal power dynamic in order to create a gynocentric society that celebrates the beauty of feminine blackness. So the thesis comes last, right? Totally anchored in the prompt, right? You got that idea of the hierarchical structural arrangement, gynocentric versus androcentric, or they say patriarchal. It's perfect. So this is really well done. The vocab is nice. Words like ratified and governed, even reinforced, privileged, problematic. The kids, patriarchal, gynocentric. So in the wheelhouse, right? Not sounding contrived, pretentious, overstretching so that they sound like a walking, talking thesaurus, but an academically solid kid. And then the sentence constructs are really nice as well. I like this. Alice Walker's intent, comma, however, comma, right? As such, comma. So you don't have to overdo it, but be able to bust out a few different sentence constructs. So out of the gate, this kid's off to a blazing start, and it's just a classic 4-sentence inverted thesis. So as example number 2 takes the exact same approach, just switches the text to the scarlet letter and focus on Hester. Religion, to some extent, is a social construct meant to control the masses. As such, structures and rules are artificially put into place to ensure that the privilege of power is left to the few. Hester Prynne, a byproduct of her puritanical setting, is witness to the arbitrary and hypocritical nature of this hierarchical structure and rebels against it. Through the binary play of light and dark imagery, Hawthorne ultimately rewrites the script of how power should be exchanged within the setting of this time period. So one of the things that you'll see students do is lay down their literary argument in the thesis and begin to drop terms and devices. So if we go back to number 1, they're talking about the racial dynamic and the gender dynamic within the piece, right? So you're going to get into binaries, dichotomies, juxtapositions. It's kind of hinted, it's implied. And, if we were to look at the body paragraph for this particular essay, that's exactly what you're going to get. So, do you need to expressly articulate the terms and devices in the thesis? Totally up to you. So some teachers say yes, some teachers say no, and the College Board is very ambivalent and wishy-washy on that. And we see that especially with FRQ1 and FRQ2, which I've already done videos for this particular year, and we've had that conversation. So let's see what student number 3 does. Let's see here. Capitalist and Marxist societies have implicit hierarchical arrangement that make it nearly impossible to escape its consequential rat race. So out of the gate, get anchored in the prompt. Totally cool. The power dynamic reinforces the following idea. If one is to be of utilitarian value, they must contribute to the machinery of the system and be a slave to their 9-to-5 job. To exist and have meaning, one must work and contribute. Melville's Bartelby is one such character who kicked the script of this power structure to the curb. I really like this one a lot because I tell my kids that I want them to write with some spunk and some flair and have pizzazz. And it's really important, I think, to get the voice, point on the rubric to have a nice teeter-totter balance of colloquial and vernacular. And I like that this student is saying things like the curb, rat race, the system, mixed with other elevated tier 2 level words like implicit is a nice word, utilitarian, the machinery, right? So when students can balance that all together with those sentence constructs, keep it tightly arranged in 4 sentences, stay anchored in the prompt, then they're going to crush it. And you'll know in all 3 of these, there's no need to say anything about the plot. So there's no need to give any plot synopsis, no plot summary at all. Just straight up nuts and bolts thesis from start to finish in exactly 4 sentences. So that's how my students, invert or declare the thesis for FRQ3. And if you're familiar with the other videos I have in the YouTube channel for FRQ1 and FRQ2, they're doing the exact same thing every single time. So the writing process gets completely demystified come, the early May, middle of May when they take their exam. They're ready to go. So the next question is, how do I write the body paragraphs? And as always, I just tacitly say, go syllogistically. For those that are new with my work and my template, I'll give a brief overview of this. And if you want to do a deeper dive, then hunker into the YouTube channel and backtrack and look at some of the videos where I elaborate on this with more detail. So in brief, the syllogistic method is rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. It comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics and oration and debate, word wrangling, wordsmithing, and oftentimes during these debates or seminars, they would throw out these juicy philosophical questions. And we see this in one book in particular that you might be familiar with called Plato's Republic. And the essential question is, what is justice? And all of these philosophical think tankers step to the mic and boom, they drop their definition of justice. Well, here's the thing. Every time a definition is offered, it's the line of reasoning is cloaked in the syllogistic method. And all that means is when you're arguing from premise to conclusion. So if I were to say something like this, premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. Ultimately, in writing or in argument, we're principally concerned with line of reasoning, with the cogency of the argument. Can you keep it, logical? Is it well reasoned? Is it bulletproof, mathematical, computative, etc.? And oftentimes, especially for FRQ3, students just don't argue. It's too plot summative. And when we define it in terms of a template for composition, this is what it looks like. The first premise is an argument containing the terms and devices. You have to say something of literary, focus, of literary merit, and argue, in that space. So the first premise, and again, those that are familiar with my work, this, is going to take 3 sentences. On the synthesis portion of the AP Lang exam, the College Board says your argument must be central. And I say that to my lit kids for all 3 FRQs. You got to argue. It's expository writing, so no plot summary. So I really like it when my students take 3 sentences to just from a tactical standpoint to make sure they are arguing something of literary value. So we'll look at that. Second premise is a little tricky, but you'll notice it's the same as FRQ3 for the AP Lang exam. It's textual support, but it comes from recall. The student has to provide the detail. And the conclusion is textual analysis, and it's the links. You got to throw everything back to the prompt, everything back to the thesis. Keep the promise of the first premise. Right? I always tell my students that what you state in the first premise is a promise. To sustain the line of reasoning, you got to go shake hands back with that guy and make sure you're talking in circles in a way. So it's really important too that the second premise be very specific. You got to drop details. You got to know your stuff. So don't talk around the text. Get into the nitty-gritty specificity of the text. So this one here is taking a look at the awakening and the character of Edna and the hierarchical arrangements in there. So it's a good choice. So let's see the first premise here. Again, 3 sentences, make literary arguments. To large extent, Edna Pontillier is a Christ-like martyr who dies as the result of her attempts to subvert the confines of patriarchy. And here's the kicker with this. In the first premise, I always tell my students, you got to say something about the prompt. So take the key language of the prompt and drop it in there. So by saying patriarchy, we are in a sense, discussing hierarchy. So we're good. We're anchored. And we're, talking about religious, biblical religious illusion. Starting with the creation story in the book of Genesis, a system was put in place that privileged male power. Chopin, through Edna, disrupts this hierarchical arrangement by creating a new feminist discourse that is not anchored in the male-centered world. Perfect. So oftentimes I tell my students, put your first premise in a promise. What do you promise the reader so that we can anticipate what kind of textual support is going to come our way? I'm expecting some kind of talk here about, religion and the idea that, man created language. And Chopin, through Edna, is going to create a new language that is gynocentric, that it's female-centered. And so let's see where we go here. Starting in the fourth sentence, the second premise begins, and I tell my students, get right into the text. Give me your textual support. Where do you see this at play? Very early in the story, feminine talk is juxtaposed to the incomprehensible chatter of birds. All right, we're cooking. This is good. One bird in particular symbolically utters, "Allez-vous in, sapristi," that's all right. This bird talk is symbolic because it correlates to Edna's attempt to give voice to her objections and attempt to flee from her husband's and society's hierarchical constraints. The jibber-jabber of the bird is literally telling Edna to flee for God's sake. Throughout the narrative, especially when Edna tries to give voice to her contempt for the powers that hold her in place, simply because she is a woman, her discourse is likewise jumbled and convoluted like the bird. This is a good textual support, good analysis of the bird, good analysis of that quote. Take, for example, her verbal attempt to explain why she had an urgent need to flee from the church service. Again, specificity. Do you remember that scene where she fled, had to get the hell out of there, right? For some reason, couldn't be there anymore. Give detail to it. Well, Edna cannot clearly articulate the reasons. The point is clear. She's fleeing from the suffocating confines of Christianity and its patriarchic order. The voice of the sea, in many regards, is analogous to the voice of feminism as Edna is trying to put forth. Throughout the story, this voice is being born as Edna begins to create a matriarchal and female-centered world for herself and others. All right, we got plenty of support. So we talked about the bird, we talked about the church, we talked about the sea. So we got like 3 layers of textual support. And one of the things that I tell my students is this, and I got to back up a slide here. Students often ask me, Mr. Kuhn, we're using templates. So for your intro, you want exactly 4 sentences. How many sentences do you want for a syllogistic body paragraph? And the answer is 10. Shoot for 10 sentences. Don't go over 12 is kind of my hard cap. So to have enough support and analysis to fully substantiate an argument, those little itty bitty 4, 5, 6 sentence body paragraphs that we often see just don't cut it. So in the conclusion here, right? And note the conclusion of the body paragraph, not the conclusion of the essay. You got to wrap it back to the prompt. In the end, Edna sacrifices her life to bring down the patriarchal hierarchy. A martyr figure like Christ, her death will allow women to take flight and have a real authentic voice independent of the male-centered world. Now, that's perfect. I stayed focused. Very good, clear line of reasoning. Go back to the first premise. Did all our textual support connect to this? Absolutely. Do we have enough textual support? Is the textual support germane? Is the textual support analyzed? Is the textual support linked to the prompt and the thesis? It all comes full circle. So that's how you do. So My students do 4 paragraphs. They do intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion paragraph. And that's just one example of how to do a syllogistic body paragraph. So I could show you more, but it's time consuming. So we're at the end here, and hopefully you found this to be useful and can use it in your classroom. Know that I got a few irons in the fire in the coming weeks and months. So first, you may have heard that Tim Freitas and Brandon Abden and I will be presenting at this fall's NCTE conference in Anaheim, California. So we're putting that together at the moment. I'm also leading some professional development with the National Writing Project. So we'll be starting that in a couple of weeks, and I'll keep the Facebook groups notified of that, as well as my email list. And I do a monthly webinar with Perfection Learning. And again, we always keep the Facebook groups notified of that. And this summer, I'm going to be doing a short course series on my own, the summer short course Teach It Right series. So it's kind of an extension of my 5-week mastermind. And at the time of making this recording, my web designer is updating my my web page, which is teachinghowtowrite.com. And you can get more details there. So we're going to do short courses on my Word Study Academy, my Nuance Academy. We're going to do AP Strategies for Success, where we only focus on the writing components of Lang and Lit, because you got all those APSy seminars that you can do, and other professional development. Just focus on the writing. We're going to do short courses on my alternative grading methods and my Plato's Plato discussion as well. So that'll take us to the fall when we begin all again. So if you want these slides so that you can host your own writing workshop, feel free to reach out at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. And for any information on anything else, feel free to check out my webpage at teachinghowtowrite.com. So be well, take care, happy teaching, and happy writing.